Let me start with a simple question. Who runs the world? For most of modern history, that question was surprisingly easy to answer. If you grew up during the Cold War, you lived in a world dominated by two giants. On one side, the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union. Two ideologies, two military blocs, two sets of rules. It was a bipolar world. Dangerous, yes, but clear. You knew who was in charge, and then the wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed, and almost overnight, the world changed again. If you grew up after that moment, you grew up in a unipolar world. One superpower, one dominant system, one country that shaped global institutions, global trade, and global security. For better or worse, the United States called the shots, and for a while, that system seemed stable. But today, that answer no longer works. Because if you ask the same question now, who runs the world, the honest answer makes many people uncomfortable, not because we don't like it, but because we don't fully understand it. We tend to believe that when leadership disappears, power disappears with it. That when there is no obvious leader, the system must be drifting, chaotic, out of control. But history shows us the opposite. When power loses its face, it does not vanish. It changes shape. And when power changes shape, it becomes harder to recognize and much harder to resist. About 15 years ago, something subtle but profound began to shift. The United States slowly stopped wanting to be the world's policeman, not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that old assumptions no longer held. At the same time, other countries grew stronger, and they learned something important. They could ignore rules they didn't like. They could bend institutions that were once untouchable. And sometimes they could even write new rules themselves. So what happened? Three things. First, Russia. Russia was never fully integrated into Western institutions, a former great power now in decline, watching a world it once dominated move on without it. That creates resentment. And resentment, left unresolved, always looks for an outlet. Second, China. China was integrated into a system led by the United States under a powerful assumption that as China became wealthier and more powerful, it would become more like the United States. But it didn't. China became richer, more technologically capable, more influential, but it remained deeply Chinese. And the United States was never fully comfortable with that outcome. Third, and this part was ignored for far too long, tens of millions of citizens in wealthy democracies felt left behind by globalization. They were told growth was good, trade was good, markets were good, but their lives didn't feel better. And when people lose trust in institutions, those institutions lose legitimacy. Now, if you look at the headlines driving geopolitical tension today, conflicts, sanctions, trade wars, political instability, most of them can be traced back to these three forces. And this is why we now live in what can only be described as a leaderless world. But pause for a moment and think about this. If the world is truly leaderless, why does it still feel so tightly controlled? Why do markets still react in predictable ways? Why do governments still seem constrained by invisible boundaries? Because leadership and control are not the same thing. Here is the mistake many people make. Leaderless does not mean powerless. It means power no longer looks the way it used to. We were taught to recognize power by its symbols, flags, armies, presidents, borders. So when those symbols blur, we assume power is fading, but in reality, it is only becoming quieter. To understand what comes next, we need to stop thinking in terms of a single world order, because the world we are entering does not have one. It has three: overlapping, interacting, and sometimes colliding. The first is the global security order, and here, the picture is still surprisingly clear. The United States remains the only country capable of projecting military power to every corner of the planet. No one else comes close. China is expanding its military capabilities, particularly in Asia. Russia still possesses nuclear weapons, but when it comes to global reach, alliances, and logistics, the system remains unipolar. In moments of crisis, countries still look to the United States for a security umbrella. That hasn't changed. The second is the global economic order, and here, power is shared. The United States is a major economic force, but it cannot dictate economic outcomes the way it dictates security. China is deeply intertwined with global trade. The European Union sets rules for the world's largest common market. India is rising. Japan still matters. This is a multipolar system. No single country controls it, and no country can afford to fully exit it. So we have a unipolar security order and a multipolar economic order, and between them, tension. The United States uses security tools to influence economic alignment. China uses economic leverage to shape diplomatic outcomes, and everyone else works tirelessly to avoid being forced to choose sides. So far, this fragile balance has mostly held. But there is a third order emerging, and it will matter more than the other two combined. The third order is the digital order, and this order is not run by governments. It is run by technology. More precisely, by the systems and companies that design, deploy, and control digital infrastructure. Think about modern conflict. Governments provide weapons. They provide funding. They provide political legitimacy. But in recent wars, it was technology companies that kept entire countries online, that enabled secure communication, that defended against cyber attacks. Without those systems, modern states become blind and deaf. Now think about politics. Technology platforms decide who can speak to hundreds of millions of people in real time. They decide what is amplified, what is suppressed, what spreads, and what quietly disappears. They do not need to censor ideas directly. They only need to adjust the algorithm. And that is an extraordinary concentration of power. When many of us were growing up, identity was shaped by two forces, nature and nurture, who you were born as, and how you were raised. Today, there is a third force, algorithm. Your beliefs, your emotions, your sense of reality, increasingly shaped by systems you did not design and cannot see. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you questioned why a particular idea appeared in front of you? Not whether it was true or false, but why you saw it at all. Now let's leave theory for a moment and look at practice. Consider Venezuela, a country sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. For years, Venezuela was isolated by sanctions, cut off from markets, economically suffocated. Its economy collapsed, its society fractured, and then, slowly, conditions changed. Oil could flow again, but not freely, under supervision, under agreements, under conditions. No invasion, no tanks, no war declarations. And yet, the outcome was unmistakable. Energy flows were redirected, dependence was reshaped, leverage was restored. This is the kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with speeches or flags. It arrives quietly, through paperwork, contracts, and permissions. And because it feels administrative rather than violent, most people never recognize it as power at all. This is what power looks like in the modern world. Not conquest, control, control of access, control of flows, control of survival. Here is the deeper insight. Power today is not about land. It is about movement, money, energy, trade, information. If you control the flow, you do not need to control the territory. Markets adjust, governments compromise, systems realign, and most people never see it happen. They only feel the consequences. We still imagine power as something loud, something dramatic, something that shocks us into attention. But the most effective power prefers silence, because silence does not provoke resistance. But even this is not the deepest layer, because beneath money, beneath oil, beneath trade, there is perception. And whoever controls perception shapes behavior, without issuing commands, without firing weapons. So let us return to the question we started with. Who runs the world? The most honest answer is not a country, not an alliance, not a flag. The next global superpower isn't who you think. It is whoever controls the systems that decide what we see, what we believe, and what we think is possible. Power used to be visible. You could point to it. You could name it. You could resist it. Today, power prefers to be invisible. And invisibility is far more effective, because you cannot fight what you cannot see, and you cannot resist what you do not recognize. And that brings us to the only question that truly matters. Who controls those systems? And what kind of world will they choose to build with that power?